Hello, beautiful community. The heavens inform me that you can see me now and not just hear me. It's so lovely and kind and generous of you to have indulged me and jumped over to the second live effort. And I do love hearing from you because I'm tremendously insecure. I have very low self-esteem. So I do love hearing from you if you can see me or hear me, because that boosts my self-esteem and makes me feel visible. Brilliant, beautiful community. Russell, the answer to your question is yes. And what Putin doesn't want is a situation where he is so desperate and his situation is so fragile that even if he were to think of the nuclear option, nobody would follow through. And we'll talk more about that. Martin, you can hear me. Jessica, hi. Everybody, hi. Hi, 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 hi. Okay, I've got to go back to the pronunciation of H school. Let's put ourselves in a slightly sort of bluntly realistic but also gentle mood, and then we'll see if we've got any questions. We're going to hang. I've really got to call the H school soon. If we're going to hang out and throw about some questions, because if you're here, the chances are you've been following me for a long time, because lives normally attract the inner bits of the beautiful community. But if you've been following me for a while, you know this analogy I often have about how our democracies are coming out of the bay, going into open ocean. But, as Werner Herzog will say, they will not sink. So we're going to experience a lot of democratic wobbliness, democratic fragility. You can read about it. I've seen questions because I've been stalking the chat about books to read. Here is one very good one. Yeah. Degenerations of Democracy. It's blue, and it's called Degenerations of Democracy. But I've been talking about coming out of the bay, going into open water. And there is something similar happening with our international politics too. And I don't think we're going to stick with exactly the same picture there, but we're going to have to think of one, because I think there's a certain tendency to think that we're still in the bay in international politics. And if the bay domestically is us thinking that our democracies are simply things that ebb and flow and that they are sort of endlessly buoyant, that there can't be democratic degeneration that's irreversible because democracy, ebbs and flows. And if we've got dramatically scary anti-democratic forces, there must be an aberration and they will dissolve in time because democracy is self-correcting. So these are all things that even when we epistemically give up on them, they act upon us, because this is stuff that is part of Western culture for 200 years and more. Various kinds of ideas of human perfectibility, social progress, political progress. But what does it mean to sort of come out of the bay in the international sense of the term? Well, I was going to share a video with you about this tomorrow on the main channel, and I began to just write down my ideas for it, and I realized I can't. It's going to take more time, because I want to make a statement in a way that casts new light without freaking us out on the fact that we're living in a disordered world, but we're talking about it as though we're way more ordered than it is. Let me just give you one example. We often think of the major global empire, the United States, as being primarily set on spreading global democracy. That's a terribly pious view, and it's a view that's ill at ease with many spectacularly catastrophic US attempts at nation building all over the world, from Afghanistan to Iraq. But nevertheless, we do believe that the United States is engaged in a kind of project of trying to undermine global autocratic forces and trying to advance the spread of democracy. And that's a story that has some grip in 2000. But we haven't had democratic globalization for for 20 years, exactly 20 years. We reached a plateau and then we started rolling backwards. Right? Um, there was more democratic progress around the world 25 years ago than today. So it's not just that democracies at home can wobble, but we've got a situation where we're telling ourselves stories about how we frame our global politics that are almost a way of speaking to a world that isn't there. It's almost like we are trying to, instead of um, reading books, we're operating with various sorts of torn pages and half chapters that are lying around from previous ideas about previous world orders that aren't any longer part of our world. We're still trying to apply them. We're talking about the spread of democracy everywhere, and democracy is in recession globally, and so on. And we often talk about as though the poles, right, um, around which global politics congregates were fairly straightforward, that perhaps there were two powers during the Cold War. Now there is one power, the United States, with also China coming up, so maybe two. But I think that's a dramatic underestimation of how many different things are going on in the international order, how many different games are being played. And understanding that will actually allow us to understand Ukraine better, will allow us to understand China-Taiwan, hypothetically, better, will allow us to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict better, because these conflicts are all fronts of a kind of a loose global war where major powers and medium powers are playing a set of different games at the same time, often games that work against each other, you know? So India and China trying to undermine Western hegemony, but at the same time, they don't want their attempts to undermine Western hegemony to undermine their own um, position of strength vis-a-vis their um, uh, conflict between each other. So there's a multiplicity of games being played, and they're being played in a world that is a world of enemies in certain respects and ever fluctuating alliances. So that's a new emphasis we're going to start exploring, because it's in that context that the whole of the brutal Putin invasion of Ukraine, as it will incarnate in 2024, that it'll be in that light that we'll have to frame it. And of course, it works the other way around too. That the United States wants significant weakening of Russia. But part of the reason the United States is scared of total weakening of Russia is because the United States is thinking that's not going to help its Cold War with China, which might not always stay a Cold War. So that's the sort of conversation I think it's important to start having. Otherwise, we're not going to understand stuff. I'm going to welcome questions about the Ukraine war as we go into 2024, because I think that's important. And also it comes against a background of transformation in Ukraine, from the sense that they're engaged in a short-term war to the idea that they're now in for the long haul. And in Russia, Putin is going to have a fake election that's going to have some significance and some potential for turbulence for him. Let me say something a little bit basic about what you're all seeing in the news, Israel-Palestine. If you're following it closely, immediately I want to say that it's always a good idea to take breaks and to see if you're not overheating by just 20%. Sometimes when you're overheating by 20% and you engage online, that can be really counterproductive. And this is exactly the sort of situation that's bound to get one overheated, especially when we don't just have deep, viscerally emotional commitments that different people have in different ways here, but we also have the expression of that commitment in the rapid disinhibited domain of social media, and in a culture which is partly as a result of social media, but partly not, is teaching us to not read well, is teaching us to not listen well. Our capacities to read each other and even before agreeing or disagreeing, vaguely be able to represent what's been said. Our capacities of that kind are diminishing. It's not because we're becoming stupider. Humans don't really become stupider, but we're becoming weirder and wonky in the way we exercise our intelligence. And I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because we don't become stupider. We don't become more superficial. Human beings today are not more superficial than they were 100 years ago. They're not more superficial than they were in ancient Greece. But maybe we describe our lives and think of our experience as though we were more superficial than we really are, and so on. So we're struggling to read each other. We've got these endemic visceral passions that take us in conflictive directions on Israel-Palestine. It's hard. Let me just emotionally say a grounding thing, though. And don't, please, take it as equalization. Sometimes it's right to say on the one hand, on the other hand, but that doesn't mean equalization. I sometimes do that, and people come away and say, ooh, that means everything is 50-50. No, not at all. It's just that I've made that on the one hand, on the other hand point. So let me make one emotionally. So what happened with the terrorist Hamas attack, which was very, very brutal, is that it triggered in a lot of Israelis a visceral reaction that, as a lot of people have pointed out, takes them back to big bad things that happened in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, when that's kind of triggered in you, you shut down very often to a capacity to capacity to hear others, empathize with others, engage, and that's understandable. And so we've really got to recognize that that's understandable and that's real, and that there is that kind of trigger. I'm somebody who's skeptical about trigger warnings in some contexts, especially in the academic context, but we've got to be realistic. So there is this image of continuity with the pogroms and with the Holocaust that's there for a lot of Israelis. It's extremely visceral stuff. And for the Palestinians, especially for the Gaza Palestinians, this business of relocate, well, how are we going to relocate? Well, relocate, well, is a visceral reminiscence, is a visceral retriggering of the catastrophe they went through, the Nakba, which is forced displacement and then the prevention of return. Forced displacement, the prevention of return. Hundreds of thousands, right? That's 20th century history. So that's triggered on that side. That's triggered on the Israeli side. That's triggered on that side. So we've got people who have been taken back to their most visceral and traumatic associations on both sides. And of course, for the folks in Gaza, that happens under the conditions of a humanitarian catastrophe and bombardment. So I just want to say that just understanding that alone emotionally should slow one down. You're not going to come into this issue like a Formula One car. You know, you're going to come into it like a slow dancer on foot. And then we can talk politics, right? Then we can talk escalation. Then we can talk Israel response. Then we can talk um, mm, mm, what is happening and not, being emphasized enough what is happening in the West Bank at the moment. Very concerning things are happening there. From an escalation point of view and from a crimes against humanity point of view. So we've got to be very careful, however, that before we slide into all of this, we just ground ourselves in how visceral all of this is. Relative Time Work says politics is undermining democracy because politics is entertainment. Well, I think that our experience of politics is as though it were soap opera, and a feature of soap opera, our domestic politics at least, and a feature of soap opera is that we half believe the characters are real and half don't. Right? These are characters we half believe in. Constructive discourse has been replaced by a scorecard, a tally of blows landed. Can we ever get back to treating serious matters seriously? Not in the current atomizing, disinhibiting, divisive climate of the social media. I mean, look at this. We're operating here in a micro bubble on the social media platform. We're trying to use it to our advantage, and we've got a very, very, very pre-selected community here that's formed over time. And even between ourselves, we have to tell ourselves to calm down. We have to tell ourselves not to freak out. We have to tell ourselves not to go. So it's hard. And I tell you what politicians say often in private, and that's that in the West, in fact, it's fairly rare for politicians, even when they're found utterly toxic by their citizens, to get terribly, terribly abused in person, right? So even with a political figure you might find utterly toxic and you might think they're ruining your country, you're not going to talk to them if you confront them in person the way you would online. We've got this and real gap, and we forget that this is not normal, right? I mean, imagine you really have just stumbled into this chat and you're Mr. Putin's #1 fan, and you hear stuff I say about Israel-Palestine, you don't like it, and you hear other things I say, you don't like it. And, you are so much less likely to talk to me in person the way you might online. And there's a real kind of distortive effect that can develop even when you don't get aggressive. Somebody who's been following the channel for a year or two, I think, just tweeted at me recently. I should have saved the tweet. I've been reflecting for a year or two, and I've decided that Vlad is a British intelligence disinformation project that's been inserted in the informational environment to warmonger around Ukraine. And that's somebody who's watched like many of my videos. And you've got to be gentle. You can't say, I can't say to that person, you're an absolute nutter. I mean, obviously that's one has things to reflect upon if that's one's perspective, but that is what this stuff does. We've got to be aware that it's not properly compatible with the sustenance of democracy on a 20-year period. It's compatible with democracy for a while because we've got such marvelous resilience of institutions, which is why we're not sinking. But we can't just say we're going to have all hell breaking loose and we'll rely on our institutions to keep us afloat. They're not made of some kind of extraordinary, otherworldly, impregnable material. That they have their frailties in the end. They're just very resilient. Eventually, they break. So, um, I saw a question about the BBC not calling Hamas terrorists. Well, that view isn't really that that mm, that is going to trigger right now in me, having spoken about not being triggered, a 5-minute rant that is incredibly important that I might even make a special separate video about. But before I go into that rant about our journalistic institutions and us saving our democracies and how the two are connected, before I go on that rant, let me say that I myself roughly approve of the BBC not calling Hamas terrorists, um, because the BBC does not call pretty much anybody terrorist, including ISIS. And there's a special history about that. And there are plenty of good reasons why they prefer to say an organization designated as a terrorist organization by states XYZ, including the UK, for example. That's what they say. Um, so it's really procedurally adequate. It's de-escalatory, and it's not at all about false moral equivalence. So I support the BBC's position on this. Having said this, here comes the rant. Let's say a few words about something on which we absolutely do not have a definitive view, which is the hospital bombing. And obviously, I'm not going to invite a view about it. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to invite a sustained absence of a view about what the hell that was on your part. But I'm going to talk just for a few minutes in a way that might bore you to death, but I want you not to get bored. I want you to try not to get bored, because this is about the way journalistic institutions help us sustain democracy. So a lot of major journalistic institutions lost the plot a bit on that. Some didn't handle it well. They jumped prematurely. And having jumped prematurely, they fluffed their lines around whether they need to acknowledge a mistake or not. Others perhaps didn't make a mistake, but then fluffed their lines too because they were scared to say that they didn't make a mistake. And just to give you a sense of how it feels, if you're a journalistic institution, how it can feel. Because of my health, I do very little at the moment of YouTube, and I'm going to try to do more. But I, some of you would have noticed, participated in this Scandinavian public TV investigation into Nord Stream and the Russian disinformation story. And as a result of just lots of clips of me talking about Western democracy came up on different platforms shared in, Denmark, Norway, and so on. And obviously they were shared outside of a YouTube bubble that you and I constitute. And I saw one of these clips, and just for laughs, I counted comments underneath. I think that this may have even been on a Twitter account of one of the broadcasters. And I counted 70 comments, each single one being negative and calling me sort of a CIA asset and so on and so forth. And that is what journalistic institutions are constantly bombarded with. It doesn't represent where the wider populations are, but that is what happens. You just put something out there and it's like a hurricane of let me put it respectfully, a hurricane of emotive collapsed trust. And so instinctively, you just want to play defense in the American sense. You just go, okay, we try not make this worse. We're going to try to just get out, just walk out of this room. We don't want to put anything to a stand. Just want to just move on to the next thing, and hopefully this isn't too big a deal. So you have this defensive sort of enclosure type psychology a lot of these institutions have. And I haven't talked in detail about this, but I have a special motto here, a special view, which is that only sort of recalcitrant, intransigent truthfulness and putting yourself out there proactively will increase your chances of surviving, right? These institutions are in danger. Journalistic institutions that speak to all citizens are in danger in our societies. And if you play defense, if you run scared, if you don't call things out, including your own mistakes, then you're contributing to the odds of your own downfall. And so on the hospital, what each major journalistic institution should have done, and I'm going to make a very important footnote to this that'll transform a bit how we think about some of these institutions. But what each journalistic institution should have done is said, let us diligently and rigorously make a judgment about whether we got it wrong. And after such a judgment, we have to go out there and say, according to our sense of what we should have done, we didn't balance it well, we got it wrong, and we recognize, we acknowledge, we apologize, we reflect, we correct, we listen. Or diligent reflection upon how one handled it, and then a decision that says, actually, we didn't do anything wrong at all. And then what you do is, even though the hurricane is coming your way from different sides, you say, we are so proud of how we handle this. We stand by everything and suck it up. That's just where we are. We're not going to move an inch. We're happy with what we did. You are on this issue the problem, not us. Okay. So aggressive acknowledgement of mistakes or aggressive standing up for oneself. Whereas what we actually saw is organizations that got things wrong saying, and organizations that didn't get anything wrong also saying, and you're given, as it were, the other team the initiative, the team that wants to get rid of you, and it feels like that's the right thing to do because you feel you're in shark-infested waters, and so you want to play defense, but you've got to play offense if you are, let's say, the BBC. Now, a qualifier. A lot of these institutions, sometimes if they're major newspapers, but even more so if they're major broadcasters, like the BBC, we often think of them, the BBC's done this, the BBC's done that, whereas in fact, an organization like the BBC, I know it a little bit from the inside, so I can tell you, is like a network with different departments, different wings that often have no idea what the other is doing, are acting in incompatible and even competitive ways. And you get tremendous, extraordinary, high caliber work in this part. In that part, you get a bit of sloppiness. You get some of the best journalism on earth that is unparalleled and unmatched in that bit. In this bit, you get just absurdity and unbelievable sloppiness or self-indulgence or incapacity to contemplate about one's mission properly and so on. So it's often a mistake to say, the BBC has done this. It's not the BBC. It's often like two 34-year-olds who've put an article out sloppily and it shouldn't be there. Whereas there are, extraordinarily sophisticated teams and departments working on complex projects at the same time. So, and that's that's what we've got. The only qualifier I would say here is that even if you can't eliminate this sort of randomness and unevenness in a big institution like that, what you can never do is allow anything that's labeled fact checking or verify, BBC Verify, for example, You cannot ever do anything like that without backing it up with real rigor. And one of the best ways for a major journalistic institution to begin syncing itself is for its own fact checking to become 90% accurate. If your fact checking collapses once out of 10, you're not just hurting your own future survival, you're hurting the survival of your democracy. And one of the things we've got going on in our society at the moment, and this applies to what we're seeing in the Middle East, applies to what we're seeing in Ukraine, we've got a crisis of fact checking. And one of the things we've got to do is get this absolutely right going forward, because we cannot have institutions calling fact checking anything less than extraordinarily careful and diligent work that's done so sensitively as though people's lives depended on it, even if they're just trying to calculate how many buckets of water were seen from a satellite in a certain village or whatever. That's how damaging it is. I have personally seen major journalistic institutions do fact checking on YouTube channels that are a little bit off with the fairies in what they say and what they do. And often these fact checking enterprises have ended up being 90 or 60 or 70% accurate. Imagine how destructive it is for a journalistic institution to go, for example, after a big YouTube channel that looks kind of irresponsible and end in a situation where that YouTube channel is partly right. How destructive that is to trust. So that's one detail we've got to get right. We do have this institution now, fact checking, and I'm afraid to say this institution is in crisis because we've got too many um, uh, too many occasions when in the world of professional journalism this is not treated sacredly. A fact check is something that either shouldn't be done at all or it should be done very sacredly. And I'm afraid I have read fact checks around areas where I have some expertise and have been very flawed, misinformed, or underinformed, to put it mildly. So there. Um, the rant has expired. I finally got it out of my system. Let's have a look at where we are. So I promise gentleness, but I'm going to try to make the excuse that we're doing gentleness in terms of sort of big picture stuff and reflective stuff, not gentleness without rants, because we just got a rant. CTC5 is saying, could I explain why I favor state solution, two-state solution? I don't favor two-state solution in the sense that I think that it's available. I don't think there is the political agency on either side to bring it about. If it's going to be brought about, it's going to be brought about externally. I have got a beautiful book by an Israeli philosopher of the younger generation somewhere here, advocating for a binational one-state solution. But my view is that it's more realistic to worry about anything that's a one-state solution becoming a kind of apartheid state. So that's why I'm saying that if there is going to be a solution, and it just doesn't look like there's any avenue for it, it's going to have to be a two-state solution. I can't quite frame a one-state solution within the next century that won't end up looking a bit like apartheid. But I just want to emphasize there's very eloquent debate about this, and so absolutely do not take my view on it. Duke is saying, I'm surprised by my own overheatability. I think it's a profoundly sort of disinhibiting environment where a lot of people are capable of things that they would absolutely never do in their private life. Very grateful. Very, very grateful. CTC is asking again about possible ways forward. Look, it's a difficult situation. What the United States is doing is probably conducting itself extremely well after the event. There's a lot to say positively about the Biden administration over the last week and a bit. But there are more questions to be asked about how we got to this situation and where the previous engagement that may have been there was. So it's something that's been really rather let go. And then once it erupted again, the engagement from the US has been strong. But it's a very difficult situation. The position of the Biden administration is they want to avoid a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza. But the Israeli war government, which is thankfully has been extended, which means we can point to a few people who are more responsible there. Um, um, so we've got the sort of Israel is in a kind of anti-Zelensky situation. It's in an extreme situation with a leader who isn't fit for purpose. But what Israel is what the Israeli authorities were looking at is really a three-way choice between aerial bombardment, aerial bombardment plus limited incursions into Gaza, number two, or three, full-scale invasion, occupation. And none of these options are good. Much of the world wants no major incursion, no minor incursions, and no aerial bombardment of the kind that we're seeing. And I don't know how that's compatible with the atmosphere, the political atmosphere in Israel, because on the ground, what's developing there is a kind of consensus that something needs to be done about Hamas. The paradox may be that they're going to make everything worse, whatever they do. That the more they do, the worse they're going to make the situation. There's a real risk of that. So that's where we are. And what the United States is trying to do is reduce the odds of what they see as the very worst option, which is a full invasion being done. But that may not be preventable either. So that's these are some of the scenarios we're looking at. The United States is trying to be a moderating hand here, but we're going to have to see how this works out. So the prospect of the conflict ending anytime soon, back to your question, is virtually zero. The prospect of this conflict dramatically escalating is not overwhelmingly high, but it's very real. Mark, I think that the world, Mark is asking, are we moving toward multipolarity or bipolarity? We're moving toward a Cold War between the United States and China that is going to be very different to the old Cold War, because the multiplicity of games that are going to be being played is going to be deeper and greater, such that it won't be possible in the same way to align what we see happening around two poles. So we're going to have two poles, but the way the world aligns around them will be much more messy and partial and fluid and so on. So I think we're not going to have multipolarity. We're not going to have bipolarity or multipolarity, but a kind of flux of big and small powers playing very different kinds of games. And this phrase I invented in this video I'm trying to put together for us on the main channel is, I call it a world of enemies in certain respects. A world of enemies in certain respects. Who suddenly, when you think, well, but why aren't you taking this stuff all the way forward? I know, because we're not enemies in every respect. We're just enemies in this respect, and then all of that might even change within a year or two. So we're moving toward fragmentation and unpredictability. Imam, thank you so much. It's been amazing having you for. I remember the first question you ever asked, which was like a year and a half ago. Grateful to have you. Good to see you, Boris. Oh, Russell saying define modern world. It's a term I use loosely. Sorry to drink electrolytes. But we're roughly talking about. We sometimes talk about the history of the West over the last 200 years. These fundamental changes, right, that happen as Europe moves into the 17th and 18th centuries. So that is not just political and technological transformation, it's also ethical transformation, right? So with the modern world, various new ethical concepts emerge, like the idea that all human beings are of equal moral worth. And to that extent, you could say that modernity, the modern world, is something that has universal features to it. It's not just the West. But one of the questions I want to sort of be a bit provocative about in the next main channel video is really about how far modernization means westernization. Like, what's it mean for a state to be in our modern world adequately, right? Does it mean looking like a liberal democracy? Does it not? We know what it doesn't mean. We know that it's not ideal to be a deranged, nihilistic, historically mystical, imperial power like Putin. Jackie, do you think what do you think is more acceptable, to stop the bombing of Gaza and allow Hamas to reconstruct, or allow Israel to clean house in Gaza? Well, a lot of people would take issue with the fact that you can clean house. And there are two conversations. One's just a generic conversation. Hi, Franny. One's just a generic conversation of, getting rid of a terrorist often makes two. But then there's the particular conversation, partly outside of my range of expertise, which is what militarily can be done in Gaza. But then there's just a conversation about radicalization, inevitable radicalization. So people are going to put into question whether anything Israel does with a ground incursion will be anything other than counterproductive for Israel's security. Forget about humanitarian catastrophe. The way we think about it as acceptable or not acceptable, I recommend for all of us to think, we have political representatives at the national level, maybe also at the local level, or some intermediate levels. What do we want them to say? What do we want them to say? That's how I recommend us to think about the position on Israel and its options. Because you see, if you sit there and say, this is what Israel should do, somebody might come back to you and say, well, I'm sorry, but they are stuck with this idea that they've got to deal with Hamas. And insofar as they're a democracy, which inside the green line they are, politicians are going to be constrained by that if the country sort of decided something needs to be done, even if that something is going to be inevitably humanitarianly devastating and also security-wise counterproductive. But to avoid all of that, you just say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not saying that this or that is exactly what Israel should do, but what am I comfortable with as a Canadian, right? As a Dane, what am I comfortable with my political representatives to say? And then you can quite comfortably say, um, if you like, no ground invasion is in my name, no bombardment of the kind we're seeing is in my name. And somebody might say, well, how are you going to take care of Hamas then? And you say, not my problem. Not my problem. This stuff is not going to be in my name, right? I'm not going to be okay with my political representatives endorsing a 10x death rate on the other side after Israel experienced an absolutely catastrophic a brutal terror attack, right? And I think that way of putting it allows you to stick to whatever you believe your position is in a politically realistic way. Um, and then you don't need to answer questions. Well, if you are Israel, what would you do? Well, you're not Israel, you know? Um, so that makes it easier. That makes it easier. Um, I think that Israel needs, and the Palestinians desperately need, people in Gaza desperately need as much of the world to behave as responsibly as possible, um, and engage in a constructing softening of the worst possibilities that are on the cards here. And the way citizens feel can be part of that. You do not need to pretend you're the Israeli war cabinet for that. I mean, let me just say something very basic. A nightmare in Gaza is incompatible with things being hunky-dory in Israel. And anybody who thinks anything otherwise has been, in my view, just really already disproven by recent history. It just ain't going to be sustainable if you don't care about the people there, if you don't care about the humanitarian. Hey, Larry, even if you don't care about the humanitarian crisis there that has got absolutely extreme now, if you don't care about that at all, which also means you've got an empathy gap you've got to bridge. Then, if that's you, um, but even if you don't care about it, you cannot have Israeli security when Gaza is having a nightmare. So that's the bottom line. And we can talk what that means in practice. Armin is saying, is it possible that almost all these recent conflicts are the fallout of the weakness of Russia? No. They are more a fallout of the weakness of the United States, which is a strange thing to say, but the United States is at once the biggest power in the world, but it's also showing fatigue, incapacity to sustain its reach, um, and an incapacity to keep a tab on different things going on around the world. And this gets us into this paradoxical conversation about there being things about US projection of power that are highly and lovely, but also certain solutions being required in the world that are unsustainable without US projection of power. Of course, Ukraine is clearly that. Imagine where Ukraine would be if Ukraine were left to Germany and France and even the UK. So the story of the United States withdrawing into itself, becoming more and more politically dysfunctional internally, not giving anybody high confidence that what they're getting today is what they're going to get in 2 or 3 years. People are very scared about the state of the Republican Party around the world. People are very scared about Biden's electability around the world. People do not feel safe that the United States is going to stably be there. Putin is trying to exploit that. But I think that um, um, decay of the US of US power, while still remaining the world's major power, is one of the themes we're going to explore. We're going to explore more, um, and that's a story there's a story that'll only deepen. Um, but um, what Putin did do is he certainly triggered, and we're going to see how it works out in practice, but he potentially triggered, absolutely, a pattern of accelerated fragmentation, um, and accelerated disorder that may work out over a decade or two. One of the things I don't want to talk about, Ricky is under the couch. Paul, Ricky's hiding under the couch because he's been used in so many analogies that he's had it now. He's having a bit of a breakdown. I won't talk about it now, but Joe Biden has proven to be outstanding at escalation management in the early parts of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, and he's proven to be a highly effective deal maker and a highly effective politician. Nico, Ricky is not gone; he's just recovering from the brutality he suffered recently. But at the same time, Joe's got palpable cognitive decline and fragility, physical fragility. I'm an expert at that. I couldn't talk or read for several years of my life due to brain inflammation. So I know exactly what that looks like. And that is not being talked about enough as an issue for 2024. And I'm afraid that the whole world is very scared about it. And the reason folks in the States are scared to talk about it because it's constantly used in Republican attacks. But we have to talk about it as an issue. Of course, it's only magnified as an issue because Kamala Harris is an unpopular politician. I mean, she's a politician that is not liable to provoke a wide sympathy, unfortunately, which only exaggerates this situation. Cheryl's asking, there isn't anybody else, so why talk about it? Because Joe Biden has got himself into a situation, he knew he was doing this, in which the safety of the world, and not just US democracy, is tied to his decision to pursue power very late in life because he really, 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 really wanted it. And he thought he'd use it very responsibly, but he really, 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 really wanted it. And he only managed to win because of the pandemic and the pandemic mismanagement, in my assessment. So the fate of the world is to some extent tied up with the issue of one man's physical constitution. So the idea that a political analytical channel isn't going to talk about it, the newspaper isn't going to talk about it responsibly, is absurd. What's happening is precisely a quietening of this issue that is very, very dangerous because it leaves all of it to the hands of Biden's enemies. But I'll do a separate episode on this, and I'll also talk to you just from a curiosity point of view about exactly how I think Joe is managing it and what his coping techniques are and so on, and how he is sometimes really freaked out by the fact that's happening to him, but most of the time he rides it very, very confidently, almost arrogantly. We'll talk about that, but I don't want to do that now. But it is an issue, and indeed I was recently noticed that speaking of books to read, Rory Stewart, who's written the best recent account of life inside politics. Rory is also very worried about how Biden's 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 health, the perception of Biden's health might play out. You see, what you could point out is that Biden's making some very good decisions, even though he's got this constitutional fragility. Because at the moment, in our discourse, you either don't acknowledge it, or if you acknowledge it, it immediately goes to, "Oh my word, he can't. He's a disaster in every way." Um, Anybody who wants Biden to win in 2024 um, needs to break that. So that's why it's important to talk about it. Levy, very kind. Miko, I'm going to talk about different connections um, between the sort of carousel of global conflict and the particular fronts that appear, like the Russo-Ukrainian war. But certainly, um, let me just for the moment reiterate one example I've given, which is that, for example, the United States is scared of an absolute defeat for Russia because and this is not my analysis. In fact, my analysis makes different recommendations. You know what that is. But the United States is scared about an absolute defeat for Russia because of the way that will impact its um, relationship with China. It might disfavor the United States and its dynamic with China to have Russia unqualifiedly defeated, and that you see what I mean? Ukraine here is a sort of a tragic victim of a world of enemies in certain respects. And the Ukrainians are saying, but come on, but like, aren't you're giving us the stuff? So don't you want us but no, but you're still, but what? And that's a very difficult world in which to be. That somebody's backing you, but not going to back you all the way. Now, there is, of course, nuclear escalation involved here, but that's not on the cards at the moment. I'm not discussing that issue at the moment. I'm saying even if you abstract that away, the United States is positively committed to avoiding an absolutely catastrophic defeat for Russia. David, you say Ben Hodges for president 2024, non-partisan. The risk here is that people come out with names they like and they say they're non-partisan. They're non-partisan in your circle. The problem is that a trust-building candidate for office in the next 10 to 30 years in the West is going to be someone who makes you feel very uncomfortable in some respects. And you've got to get around that idea, because what you're saying, David, is again the easy solution, which is just a reproduction of the problem. It's not a solution at all. Get in somebody I like. The politicians that will build trust are going to be extraordinarily rare to find, are going to be politicians who a lot of different demographics in society feel very uncomfortable about. For example, they might contain elements of populism, but institutionalism and inclusivity. So inclusive populism that is also institutional. It's really hard. It's really hard. That will provoke quite a few liberals, quite a few liberals in the non-American sense. No, liberals in the American sense, actually. They'll provoke quite a few liberals, because that'll be somebody who might give up on quite a lot of progressive discourse, and it might be somebody who will be on the right on some issues, whether we like it or not, on the left on others. And that's a fascinating conversation in and of itself. What's a candidate for political office who will most reduce the decline in trust? Right? Because when Joe Biden's in office, and he's been a very good deal maker, and he's been a very effective president in many respects, but him just being in office dramatically reduces trust in politics in the United States. It does irreversible damage to U.S. democracy that he's in office. What does that mean? It means virtually anybody who is in office will do irreversible damage. That's the level of crisis we've reached. That we've got to say, look, we're in a pattern of decline where whoever we get in, that decline will continue. But we can slow it down, and we won't democratically collapse, hopefully. And that decline can be something we work with. We can slow it down a bit. But we've got to recognize that it's a difficult one. We're trying to thread something through a needle here when we're talking about a candidate for political office who will not undermine trust. It is going to be a political candidate who has to carry in the United States a lot of Trump voters. In some ways, on some framings. Suddenly becomes scary, but it has to be done. And I have some predictions about how politicians in the center, on the left, and the right will be responding to that over the coming decades and so on. But this is a really uncomfortable situation. What we've got is a situation where certain framings and certain policies will not be dramatically undermining of trust, but certain other policies inevitably will be. But they might be policies that are also good and responsible, but they might undermine trust. So how do you strike that balance? And one of the things that progressives, which most of you are, with a small p at least, there's not too many. There's plenty of lovely conservatives in this community, and we love pro-democratic conservatives. But probably most of you wouldn't call yourselves conservatives. You'd be to the left of that or to the center of that. But the point is that I'm going to have to cut this rant short. But the point is, we're going to have to give up the idea that you can just have whatever policy you want, even if it's reasonable, no matter whether you can gather civic support for it. So I'll give you an example. One of the things we've lost civic support for in the West is a human rights-based approach to immigration. And that's an argument we've lost. And I'll be making a video about how to frame a pro-human rights immigration position. But we're in the kind of situation where any position on immigration that is remotely decent toward human rights is democratically toxic. Difficult situation. It's a difficult situation. And we've got to factor that in as voters. And no, it doesn't matter that I'm sitting here, and if you said to me, well, everybody living around me here from tomorrow is going to be from Syria, I'm going to be in love with that. It's going to be fantastic. But I'm me. I'm not the other 60+ million people who are going to be living in this society, and some of them are going to be voting. So these are some of the big challenges we're going to keep talking about. Jessica, good point. But I do think that the human rights perspective is still very big in how progressive parties frame immigration. And I'm going to fall off my chair with David's recommendation of Rudy Giuliani for president. What we're going to have to move toward is the language of community and the language of the guest and the gift, and the discourse which doesn't say this is what immigration policy we're going to have, and I'm going to persuade a population of it. But the other way around, unfortunately, if you're going to sustain trust, you're going to see what you can persuade your citizens of, your population of, and then you have to do that policy. And if you fail to persuade them of X, you can't then go on to do X. What we've had historically in the West is a situation where we do X, and we know our population isn't so happy with it, but we do it, and then we try to persuade them, and then they tell us to go screw ourselves. And that we've got to start reversing that dynamic. To a big cat saying Elon's ruined X. Well, let me tell you something that I genuinely, in a non sort of escalatory way, think is true about the situation on X. The interconnectedness between academic experts has broken down very considerably, and the interconnectedness between professional journalists has broken down very considerably on X. I don't care what else is true or isn't true, but that's the point I want to make today. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, unfortunately. So that kind of linkage is broken down. And it's harder now to follow sort of your 77 or 177 experts. It's harder now on there. But at the same time, I think that we have a systemic crisis of our public squares, which means that my commitment is precisely to stay on Twitter, because it's become a mess. Because it's a public square that's just become a mess. It was a bit of a mess before too. Now it's a worse mess, but I'm going to stay there. I'm going to keep, sharing there, because why would I leave my public squares? One of my public squares, even if it's being badly mismanaged. It just makes Twitter worse if you are responsible on it and you leave, with a huge exception that, of course, you leave if it's better for your mental health, for the way you personally organize information. But I'm lucky that just stuff coming at me doesn't affect my mental health, so I can stay on there easily. And I'm grateful for a lot of other people who are staying on Twitter, even though they don't like it, because they don't like it. The big cats left X for mental health. I think it's a very reasonable decision. How's rules of being gentle and not compatible with my rant, so I'm a hypocrite today. Braden, how does the Republican Party pull itself out of its civil war? How does it look better tomorrow? A lot of the people online who are discussing American politics systematically underappreciate how much US politics, of course, is uniquely American, but is also vulnerable to some of these global patterns. And one of the global patterns we're seeing is, Ron, I'm not on Telegram. I mean, I am on Telegram just to read stuff, but I don't share there yet. I might at some point. But I'm going to keep talking to this community about connecting more directly via mail lists and so on in the future, and it's really important. The problem for the Republican Party that I want to mention today, there's plenty of particular problems that are particular to it and to America. But the problem that I want to mention today is the global growth of the anti-constitutional right. That we've got a situation where most conservatives in politics aren't conservative anymore. They're anti-democratic populists, or they risk moving in that direction. I just showed recently a book by a genuine conservative, Rory Stewart, Now, I'm not a conservative, but I love conservatives because, in principle, a conservative is got democratically impeccable credentials. Um, Conservatives love parliaments. Conservatives love courts that are independent and so on. But what we've got is the collapse of the constitutional right and their substitution by the anti-constitutional right. And the the problem is that the Republican Party is part of a global wave of right-wing parties ceasing to be conservative. And sometimes that's palpable when that change happens, but most of the time we don't notice it. We don't notice it. Uh, we think that it's just same old, same old, same old. But no, we've now got this wave of politicians like Boris Johnson in the UK, for example, who are set on breaking the democratic game. And we've got other politicians who aren't overtly doing that, but they are profoundly entrepreneurial, which leads them to do things that more or less have, on a less dramatic scale, the same effect. So what we want now is to ask, where have all the conservatives gone? Where have all the conservatives gone? That's a global pattern, and that's dramatically reflected in the US Republican Party. Mael is asking, pro-democracy conservatives, you mean conservatives that only like democracy so long as gay and trans people don't enjoy it? Yeah, I'm not too fond of those types. So I'm going to be very, very, very tough here. That's not going to fly. That stuff, what you've written, it's not going to fly. In other words, you're not going to keep your democracy with these kinds of dispositions. A conservative who comes along and says, well, I don't love gay rights, I'm not in favor of them, is your political opponent. And what you've got to do is say, well, you're a moron. I love gay rights. I'm going to fight for gay rights, and I'm going to make you lose. But both you and them accept, you see why I'm being tough now, right? Both you and them accept elections, which you can use to kick government out. You accept that you're not going to be Mr. Orban and eliminate media, muzzle the courts, right? There's a very big procedural difference here between the conservative who has views on gay rights that you and I are not going to like, and a conservative who wants to destroy democracy. And the idea that you are, after this point that I deliberately emphasize now, the idea that you are conflating the point I made, which is an existential democratic point, with a non-existential democratic point about conflicts of rights, right? Is an indication of how poor we all are together at realizing that there's a threat to our democratic institutions that's existential. Because your question comes from 1998. Because if you don't make a distinction here, the difference is going to be very clear. With the pro-democratic conservatives, you're going to have unjust outcomes for gay people. With the anti-democratic conservatives, you're going to have a catastrophe for various kinds of minorities. So the idea that they're all the same is not remotely going to fly, and you're not going to get away with it over a 10, 20-year period. Because if you keep not seeing that difference, it's going to bite you really, really hard in the bum at the level of your aspiration to ensure that you live in a world in which you can cast your vote and it actually makes a difference. That you live in a world in which you can take your government to court and you won't necessarily lose. Right? So there is a difference. And another way of framing the difference is it's a difference between opponents and enemies. The conservative who has a different view about gay rights to you, a view you might be deeply offended by, you just might want that view to lose at the ballot box. But the difference between that and somebody who says, well, screw the courts, screw the ballot box, screw democratic counter-majoritarian institutions, the difference is that that person isn't just your opponent, they're an enemy now. That creates a further paradox of the fact that now we've got a situation where we have got to treat, to a good extent, as opponents, people who are enemies of democracy, because if we treat them as enemies, it'll undermine democracy even more. That's another kind of paradox that's emerging. But I'm going to be really, really tough on you to distinguish some kind of a Christian conservative who doesn't want to say things you and I want to say about gay rights, but believes in all the democratic institutions that matter, and then somebody who doesn't, somebody who is told by a court to clear off from the government and says, no, I'm going to stay, right? That's why it's so existential. And what your question is speaking to is this distinction between enemies and opponents. And what I'm recommending you to do is to take these conservatives and treat them as your opponents, because they're absolutely not your enemies if they believe in these institutions, right? Because even if you lose to them, you can beat them the next time round. That's politics. But what we've got now is a bunch of people on the right who aren't conservatives anymore, and they want to end the situation in which they beat you, but you can come back and beat them after, right? Mr. Orban doesn't like anybody coming back and beating them. So. And it doesn't matter how much we don't like them on other issues, on the climate and so on, which is a vital existential issue. But this is the point, that John Major is not Boris Johnson. Mitt Romney is not Donald Trump. Eric, sanctity of non-combatant life. Do you think your tweets on the subject are too charitable to Israel about its brazen disregard of Palestinian life? I'm speaking as a public intellectual, and my style of being a public intellectual is not to be a moralist, but to be somebody who often gives uncomfortable friction, like I've just done. Right? I haven't just been mean for the sake of being mean. I've given some uncomfortable friction because the question came from a place that was a way of getting things wrong that we're all tempted into. So it absolutely wouldn't help if I tweet condemnations of the disproportionality of Israel's bombardment campaign. What does that give? It gives you a position. Well, there are other people with that position. I don't want to give a position. I'm happy to give a position. I can tell you exactly what my position is, but it's my position as a citizen. It's not my position as a public intellectual, in the sense that my job as a public intellectual is not just to recite my position as a citizen. I'm not here to walk around with expressive sort of stickers. So here is where I stand. I'm for all the good things against the bad things. So what I wanted to do is very deliberately put front and center a distinction that detached the prosecution of the war from the justice of war. And that way of talking by me was a much more powerful critique of what Israel is doing, in fact, than any direct statement of the kind that you see going around that just says disgraceful and unacceptable evil, or even genocide, which is not. Um, we've got to be careful with these terms. We've got to always use them when they really apply. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, they all have their place. There's a lot of terribly ghastly things that are completely unacceptable. They don't qualify for all of these tags. So I would say that if you're looking for me to have an effect, what I did had a much bigger effect on YouTube, not on Twitter. I think I only have 15,000 followers on Twitter, but on YouTube, that had a bigger effect. The emphasis on that distinction, and it also calmed people down because it offered a way of thinking about it that was really detached from issues of how just one's cause to go to war is, and it just focused on um, how one prosecutes a war. So I did that deliberately. I'm very happy about it. But that's the kind of decision that I make. You see, I'd not give you as much if I just said, "Oh, baddies are doing bad things." It's not nourishing you. It's not giving you any more resources to react to what's going on. Um, if I thought that was helpful, I'd do it. Because speaking about this issue is profoundly um, 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 ungratifying on YouTube. I mean, everything on this platform is begging me not to talk about Israel-Palestine, but I'm not going to comply with that. But the point is that speaking about that fundamental distinction between competence and non-competence can be very powerful. It's inviting. It's also inviting of different people who have different views on this. It's also, to some extent, my job to help some of the folks in this community not to freak out and so on. Moreover, um, an understated, underimplied condemnation can sometimes be more profound than one that's very literally put. So there. So if you want my views as a citizen, they're not even 5% as important as what I'm saying as a public intellectual. But if you ask me, am I as a citizen of the UK comfortable when my leader of the opposition says on the radio that Israel has the right to do the siege, which he perhaps feels now he misspoke, that Israel has the right to intensify the siege and cut the water and heat and so on. No, I don't want my political representatives to comply with that at all. But I'm not sitting here and telling you what my positions are, because quite frankly, my positions aren't necessarily better than yours on an issue like this. So what are you going to get from it? I'm not going to give you much. And you always have to ask of content you consume, what am I getting from this beyond just views I like? We're in a spiral online of people following content creators to get views they like in a more intensified form, even so that they then themselves develop it in a more intensified form, and then cause the content creators to develop them in a more intensified form, and on that carousel goes. It becomes a sort of an echo chamber. So, yeah, I'm very keen to focus on this business of digestibility, putting stuff into your tummy that is morally and physically good for you beyond just, you know, clear statements of how one takes all the sides one takes. Good Pants saying that a lot of my conservative friends have felt alienated about stuff said about them that feels unfair. It's a double-sided process. I think a lot of conservatives are feeling unseen, but a lot of conservatives have stopped believing in democracy and haven't noticed that they've stopped believing in democracy, and that's a crisis too. So you can't say that. You can't say that and then make 17 arguments for why Trump is great. I mean, you can, and you need to be dealt with as a citizen, but the closer you come to something like a proper kind of intellectual discourse on this, and still have that position, the more you're going to get critiqued, because you can't say respect my conservatism, but by the way, I'm happy to say that elections that are real aren't real. Levi, good question. We're going to be talking about stuff that books like this are about more. Um, we've spoken a lot about it on chat, but I'm going to make a main channel video about Western populism. And even people who just want stuff on Ukraine are going to benefit from it greatly, because it goes absolutely to the core of um, the sustenance of Western support for Ukraine. Hohum, that's a local question. That often will help in some context, proportional representation. In other contexts, it won't. But there's nothing we can do like that that'll solve the polarization, because the polarization is deep. We can mitigate it, but not solve it. Jack Rabbit, Hannah is asking, have we ever not been polarized? Yes, there is something happening post September 11th, but especially into the 2010s, that is qualifiedly different, qualitatively different. So I do think there's a very big difference. This is not just a little bit more of the problem we had before. This is a new historic challenge that we face. But we're not going to sink. But we're going to be in open water. But we're not going to sink. But we're going to be in open water. The internet is probably one of the 5 causes, yes. Kudos. Our domestic politics was certainly not polarized, more polarized than it is now, Hochum, during the Cold War. Was the world more polarized? In international politics, sure. It was more based around 2 poles than it will be even when the US-China Cold War heats up. Brandon is saying, I'd argue marginalized people have no power, but I know the perception is that. What we need urgently is the recognition that a lot of marginalized people don't have power, but that our methods for giving them power have not been successful so far. And we need to reflect very, very clearly on why that is. And there follows a conversation about identity politics in its current shape. Neil is saying, maybe it's better to go off, live in a log cabin. I mean, one of the things that separates humans, not into right and wrong, but into different personalities, different sensibilities, is how much we want to remake the world into something that it could or should be, versus how much we love the world as it is. And this is a matter of personality. I must say that personally, for me, as deep as my commitment is to humans avoiding the worst evils that befall them in virtue of politics treating them badly. As much as I say that, I am myself sort of not depressed by the darkness of the world, in the sense that I love human beings as they are. and I'm always less rather than more inclined to remake the world into being the world as it should be. I think when it comes to human beings experiencing evils, maybe in that dimension, I do want to remake the world, but in most other dimensions, I I I I love in all its absurdity and in all its conflictiveness um, what we are, and that's not right or wrong, just this sensibility. But it allows me to be a philosopher as opposed to, for example, a moralist. Yeah, the big cat is saying they've become a Schopenhauerian pessimist who hates the world. That's the opposite of me. I love, 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 love all of you guys and the world. And I think we've reached an hour and a half. Um, now I'm gonna go and call up the helpline for people who make uncontrollable rants online. Hopefully they'll be able to offer me some assistance, and I'll definitely be honest with the people on the hotline that you've been incredibly patient with me while I've suffered from these ranting predilections. Lots of love and talk very, very soon. Really, really grateful to have had you all. Bye, Jessica. Amalfitano. Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye, Chris. Bye, Cheryl. Bye, 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 Michelle.